who are here. Peter and Matt are here today. Are going to talk about cybersecurity issues, which I don't speak the language, but they will. But I'm just going to hand it off to either Phil or Matt or Peter, and you guys could just take it away and tell us everything that we should be worried about.
Most people, when they think of cybersecurity, companies don't want to ever talk about it. They certainly don't want to be known that they've come under an attack. They feel it puts a stigma on them that, they put people's information at risk and data like that. I talked with a close friend of mine today who's a beer wholesaler who notified me that Coors Molson was down for over a week due to a cyber attack. There was no press that one of your largest manufacturers of beer in the world was non-operational for a week due to a security attack. We've all gone through the TJXs. We've all looked at the Anthem, Blue Cross Blue Shield. There are multiple cases of companies that are out and vulnerable flying today without the proper protection of insurance to cover them if this ever happens. And it is happening frequently. There is a substantial uptick. And one of the things that I really liked about this program for people was the ease of the application process. You don't need to be bringing in your entire IT support team to answer questions that, frankly, most people do not know the answers to, because these guys have done an incredible job of working on the underwriting, analyzing the risk, being able to work behind the scenes so that the person looking for coverage with very few questions can apply and receive a quote very quickly. So we're excited about this program. I think everybody should be getting a quote so that they can look at what it truly costs to protect them. And with that, Matt, I'll turn it over to you. I appreciate you guys taking the time. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. That was a great intro. That's exactly right. What we're trying to do is make the process a lot simpler. Obviously, cyber insurance has come to the forefront these days, and you see it in the news all the time. But what people don't realize is that, everyone is being attacked from big to small. So just to give a little background, my name is Matt Tobia. I'm with K2 Placements. I'm an insurance broker, and I'm here with Peter Hedberg with Corvus Insurance, and he is an underwriter. And just to give, a little explanation about what the differences are, you would work with me directly. I'm a client-facing person, and Pete and I work hand in hand, getting these risks placed and then handling any claims on the back end. But as Phil was saying, the whole point to what Corvus has created is to simplifying the application process. And so it's just a number of questions all online, and within a couple minutes, you actually have a bindable quote with a series of different options. And more than that, what Corvus provides is a comprehensive policy that is not duplicated in the marketplace right now. The different coverages that they offer for the price and the limit that they can provide is just second to none. So Pete, I'll let you kick it off. If you wouldn't mind sharing your screen with some of the material, and we can get going.
Awesome. Thank you. As Matt was saying, we're a little bit different than a traditional insurer. I think traditional insurers are used to just kind of, taking premium and sending you a promise back that they'll pay if something goes wrong. I think the years of being a passive insurance company are kind of done. I think because the technology is available and because Silicon Valley really believes in the power of technology to help insurance right now, we've taken it on as our mission to become more involved with our policyholders. That includes feedback for how to make their systems more secure, scoring, tools that we make available through different portals. So when you sign up for a policy with us, it's not just, signing a check for, the premium to us. We want to onboard you. And we believe in this virtuous cycle where we're going to spend a little bit of money on you guys to make you a better risk. Hopefully that translates to a little bit lower premium for everybody else. And then, again, virtuous cycle, we just keep doing that. So great example, very recently, Microsoft released a bunch of vulnerabilities for people that still use on-premises Exchange. We were able to passively identify who was using them within our book, and we wrote emails to everybody. We said, you guys got to remediate this as fast as you can. And we had claims. That caused claims for us when we did that, because several people came back and said, uh-oh, I found intruders. And I was like, that's fine. It's better we find them now than later. And Phil, you brought up a really, really good point about a lot of these recent events, how you haven't heard about it or have heard about them. Either way, they're an existential threat to businesses. So I've had claims that have put businesses out of this. And the sooner you detect it and the faster you start to remediate makes a big difference. So that's sort of a segue into Matt. I'll scroll to whatever one you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, you know what? Before we get into the claim examples, one other point that I wanted to make that Pete, maybe you can elaborate on is, in addition to the application process being, significantly simpler than anything else in the market, in addition to the coverage enhancements that just aren't found everywhere, one big thing that Corvus does is once you bind a policy, they provide a risk report that allows, whoever is handling the IT within the department, whether it's, inside or whether you outsource it, it kind of gives a blueprint to what is going well within your organization and what is subpar. And so you can use that report to then strengthen your system, which then in turn can also, make your policy even better. So in terms of examples, we're on the oil and gas. What I think the best ones, if you scroll down a little bit farther to the next page, the two in the middle here are kind of the biggest that we see. And these are involving shutdowns. And so in both of these examples, malware got in, and what they did was they essentially shut down the internal networks of these two operations. And so they weren't demanding any ransom. They weren't asking, for anything in return, but their intent was malicious. And so for both of these organizations, if you can imagine having everything that your network's just inoperable and what kind of impact that would have to your business, you're looking at claims from getting a forensic investigator involved to legal expenses. And probably the most important, which we'll talk about in a little bit, is the business income expense that comes out of it. So if you're shut down for 2 weeks, which some of these operations were, you're not making any money and you're losing income. And so what business income is going to do is it's going to replace that, and as well as some of the extra expenses that you go through. That's a good place to start. And I think if you go over to maybe the retail example, we can touch on that a little bit. And Phil, I know you mentioned, TJX, which is a perfect example, but also Staples. In both of these situations, the hackers got in, they infiltrated their payment systems, and then they released, millions of user credit card information, debit card information. So, and what people think is, listen, I'm not Home Depot. I'm not Staples. I'm just little old me, and nobody wants to target me. But it's just simply not the case. I mean, it happens to the big people, and you see it on the news. But in the reality is, all of these organizations had some pretty significant issues that came out of this. I mean, just as an example, all these situations required legal expense to investigate, forensic costs to go in and figure out what actually happened, how much damage is being caused. And then legally, you're responsible for PCI and DSS assessment expenses, which you're legally obligated to pay once you start releasing other people's information. And then there's an ongoing credit monitoring for all these people as well. So if you can imagine, if you're one of these people from Staples who shop there, and now all of a sudden your information is publicly available, what implications could that have to you personally? And so, again, going back to Corvus's policy, there's a lot of ambiguity in the marketplace because, for what it's worth, cyber insurance is relatively new. It's probably only been around for 10 or 15 years, and in the insurance industry, that's nothing. And so many different carriers have different terms for what coverage is provided, and there's not a standardized, template for everyone to go by. And so what you find is you might think you buy a cyber policy, but it doesn't actually give you all the bells and whistles that come with it. And that this PCI compliance is one of them. Oftentimes, many carriers exclude that coverage. And yet you can imagine if you're collecting any of this sensitive information, you're going to be responsible for these kind of restitution costs.
Matt, it's roughly about $125 a person was what I know that when Anthem Blue Cross Blue Shield got hit, they figured it would cost them around $125 per person to the notification, the credit protection, etc.
That's exactly right. And it varies by state because every state has their own, individual compliance issues.
Yeah. So there's a report that comes out every year from the Ponemon Institute. It's PONEMON, but they calculate hard costs, right? So it costs $1 to put a letter in the mail or to email somebody. And it costs $8 to $12 to offer credit monitoring for at least 1 to 2 years per person. But then what they try to calculate, and this is the terrifying number, is what is your long-term drag on income? What's your long-term drag on reputation? All of those things. And so that's where that $125, and by the way, that's coming down. It used to be $250, but it's
Right.
also different for segments. It's different for healthcare. It's different for retail. But that's an important number to keep in mind when you're working around, buying this insurance and how much limit you want.
If you wouldn't mind switching over to the GCs, there's
Sure.
a couple good examples here of ransomware, which is what you normally see in the news. So, for instance, if in this top example, there was a ransomware attack on a construction firm, essentially what these hackers do is they get in, they take control of your system. First, you have the issue of you can't operate because you don't have access to any of your files or materials. It shuts all your people down. So now you got your entire workforce just sitting idle because they can't do anything. But then what's worse is these hackers come in and they say, if you want your system back, you're going to have to pay us, X amount of millions of dollars. And we want it in Bitcoin, so it's not traceable. And so you sit there and, if you want to operate your business, you're beholden to paying the ransom. Otherwise, you almost have to start over, which a lot of times is just not even possible. And in some cases, if you have backups, that alleviates some of the problem. But often cases, you're still going to have to pay legal expenses. You're still going to have to pay forensic costs. You're going to have to pay the business income expense of being shut down and not operating. You're obviously losing money. And then you have to pay that ransomware or ransom costs. So most notably, I think there was an insurance company that was hacked not too long ago. And I think the payout was noted at about $100 million. Now, that's a very significant number because that's a huge organization, but a lot of times these can be as small as $50,000, but it's something they know you have the wherewithal to pay, and small enough that you're going to pay it. So a lot of times the ransomware is the most common use of these hackers and what they're doing.
Yeah, and it's also important to note, if you're not carrying this insurance right now, that doesn't mean the hackers are going to negotiate with you and say, oh, you don't have insurance. Sorry, we'll give you a discount. Yada, yada, yada. These hackers are not incentivized to bargain or haggle a lot of the time. They're incentivized to try to get the top amount they possibly can. And their downside isn't much other than they just destroy the encryption key and they leave your business in limbo forever. So and the numbers have been escalating, right? So when I started underwriting, I used to be an insurance agent, on the distribution side with Matt. But when I started underwriting, ransoms were, a big one was 25K. Now we're seeing demands exceeding 10 million a lot of the time. And for small businesses, they're regularly becoming $1, $2, and $3 million demands. Again, all paid in Bitcoin. These guys, in my opinion, there's a special place in hell, especially for the guys that are going after healthcare institutions right now. In the middle of a pandemic, they made it a priority to attack hospitals and clinics and other medical facilities because they knew that they were going to pay. That's why they wanted to do it. So
yeah, and Pete, why don't you take a second and just explain some of the actual way that these hackers operate? I mean, I know you were telling me before that they have sales incentives just like every other business. They have goals and they have reporting that they have to do. I mean, it's a 24/7 job and people check in and check out.
Yeah, so 22-year-old kid in Moscow right now wakes up, puts on a tie, and shows up at a big, server farm with a bunch of cubes, puts on a headset, and his job is to hack all day. It's called ransomware as a service. And so you can go onto the dark web if you're a bad guy, and you can hire these guys. They're for hire. They have reviews. They have annual reviews where they meet with their boss. They have to hit certain numbers. It has become so industrialized. It's scary. I try to create an analogy, and it's difficult to conceptualize, but if everything that was happening on the internet right now was physical, and there was a physical place, we would be in the middle of World War III. So, and the US is obviously not innocent in this either. We attacked an Iranian nuclear facility along with Israel to hobble it with Stuxnet. That caused a reaction from them, and it's been going back and forth ever since. So we are engaged, unfortunately, in this sort of electronic combat, and it's been going on for a long time. And unfortunately, the spoils of war, it's lucrative to go after private businesses right now to try to fund that war. So with that said, I was just going to touch on a couple of kind of the key things within the policy that are really important for when you're buying this. So when you buy this insurance, it's a little difficult to explain because it's like a Happy Meal policy. There's kind of a lot of components that are built into it. And typically insurance is always broken down into property or casualty, right? Did your building burn down? We buy a new building. Or did you hurt someone? We'll defend you for hurting someone. This has both of those kind of built in. So on the third party coverages, if you're liable because you've exposed data and it was healthcare data, so now you have the Office of Civil Rights coming after you for a HIPAA violation, that's something we defend you against. Same thing with PCI, Matt mentioned that earlier. If you owe contractual assessments because it's determined that you were the nexus for the disclosure of all that credit card data, we're going to pay for that as well too. Also, you might be legally required to put letters in the mail, provide credit monitoring. That's another thing that we pay for. On the first party side, so this is more like the property side, right? This is where we're going to pay you as the policyholder to try to restore and get your business operating again. We're going to pay for lost income. Also, if you're using an IT vendor or other outsourced service provider that gets attacked, and then that has a downstream impact, we'll pay for that as well too. That'll trigger our policy. We'll pay to restore data, whether that be from a backup or whether we have to literally take paper records and somehow reconstruct an electronic file of your business. System failure will also cover it if there's an administrative error that shuts down your system. Social engineering and cybercrime. This is a big one. You guys have probably all heard of phishing. This is when somebody impersonates someone else and tries to get key credentials or gets one of your employees to wire money to someone else. We'll pay for the lost money. That usually also triggers a bigger loss because we have to figure out whether there had been a breach or not that caused that. We'll pay you income if you have a reputational loss that carries forward. And then more importantly, right under that, you'll see cyber extortion and ransomware coverage. We do pay the ransom. We have a tacit agreement with the federal government right now that we're not going to pay bad guys if we know they're bad guys. Wink, wink. We never know that they're bad guys because none of these guys who are hacking right now are going to be like, I'm part of the Russian government or I'm part of the Russian mob or something like. They're never going to self-identify. So that hasn't been an issue. So we continue to be able to pay ransoms. And then we do remediation expenses. So Matt mentioned forensics several times. Forensics is the fancy word for the guys that show up and have to repair things on your system. We work very closely with either your outsourced IT vendor or your IT director to basically find out where all the bodies are buried. Where is your data put? How did you have it configured before? How can we restore it? How can we get people's email operating again? Real basic stuff. There's a few other things that are included in the policy that are kind of nice to have. Bricking coverage. So if you get attacked and you have malware on your servers or on your hard drives, a lot of times forensics people can restore those hard drives, but at one time or another, there was bad code written on them. And so the decision might be made to actually just replace that whole hard drive. So bricking will actually cover the replacement of some of those physical assets, which is very nice to have. The application process, as Phil had mentioned earlier, is not difficult. We have a link out there. You click on it, put in your name, put in your URL. If your business has a website, that's a big deal for us. It's how we run our scan. It's important to note our scan is not invasive. No one's going to show up at your front door and ask to see your server room or anything like that. It's all very passive. It's all public IP available data that we can find. So I liken it to Paul Blart, the mall cop. You know, he's going to go from store to store and just, you know, rattle the handle to make sure that it's locked. If it's open, we don't enter, but we're going to flag it. And we'll include it in our report for you guys. So then you put in the URL, your revenue, your business class. For you guys to be, you know, business to business distributors. It's how we would view you guys as far as the propane distribution is concerned. And then whatever limits you want. I think most organizations are buying between 1 and 5 million limits. Some larger organizations are buying well in excess of that. There is capacity in the marketplace to support a much higher limit if you want that. And then you hit submit. And it's going to hit my system. We'll run our scan, and then we will compute our premium based on the results that we see and what limit you wanted. And then we will send a quote back out. So it's a very fast process, and it requires very little information. You don't have to get on the phone with anybody. It can all be done, you know, with emails or stuff like that. So that's generally how it works. And again, I'm the insurance company. Matt is my distributor as the agent. He's the individual that you work with. But That's generally how the process goes. So with that said, Matt, I don't know if you want to add anything. I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah, one thing you mentioned when you were going through the coverage and claim examples is social engineering. And that's something that is harder and harder to get on your cyber policy, and is starting to cost an arm and a leg. And the reason is because it happens so often. What we're seeing in the marketplace is that carriers are they're shying away from it because everyone has a vulnerability to it. And just as an example, it's happened to my company, and it's happened to probably a lot of the people who we're talking to right now. But what these hackers do is they create a email address that looks very similar to someone that you're interacting with. They infiltrate your system. They're reading your emails. And so this is more of a passive attack. They sit back and they wait, and they find a situation where you're about to, communicate and transmit money digitally. So let's take it, for instance, you're going to buy a new facility, and there's a down payment that has to be made, and we have to wire about $100,000 to a bank account. We all know this is part of the transaction. Well, what they do is they find the email address where you're normally interacting with. They make a very small change that is, undetectable to most people unless they're looking very closely. For instance, if you're interacting with Joe Smith at google.com, they make their email address joesmith1. And so you really don't detect that subtle change. And then what happens is they tell you, hey, Matt, that building you're about to buy, that $100,000 down payment that, you have to come up with, wire it to this account and send it, as soon as you can, and we can get this deal done. And so what happens is you're willingly giving your money to somebody else. And so that's not covered in many other situations because you weren't forced into doing it. And so what social engineering does is this coverage picks up those types of situations where, you're willingly giving the hacker the money that you meant for another transaction. And like I said, it is very difficult to come by these days. Usually these limits are sublimited to about $50,000 if you can get it. And what Corvus does is they offer anywhere from $100,000 to $250,000 right off the bat within your policy. And so, it's a huge coverage enhancement that we're just seeing all over the marketplace right now.
And Matt brings up an interesting point about the email. So we call it BEC, business email compromise. That's the vector that's used for a lot of cyber attacks. So you probably, when you think cyber attack, you're thinking like Hollywood, the movies, somebody's like brute force trying to get into your system with codes and all that. Typically, they're just trying to fool somebody that works for you into giving away information they need to get in your system. So I don't mean to terrify everyone, but you're only as protected as your dumbest employee. And Matt has sold a lot of insurance. And I don't say it because I'm trying to sell insurance. I say it because it's the truth. So that's one reason why when I'm underwriting, I'm looking for a lot of things, but two big things I'm looking for right now: employee training and awareness training. And this is something we can either get you a discount on or we can offer you if you become a policyholder with us. And then another big thing is multi-factor authentication, which that's just a fancy phrase for every time you log in, you have to use a second way to verify who you are. A lot of times it's being done with a text message to your phone, or you carry an app on your phone, which has a token or an authenticator app that then generates, and then you have to type in the number. It's annoying. Everybody hates it, but I got to tell you, it is one of the strongest weapons we have against hackers right now. And it's been very effective in fighting them.
So did I hear a number that it was over $100 if there was an incident trying to get a value on when you do have a disruption or a hack? What was the number, that dollar amount per customer?
I'm actually going to pull it up real quick.
Yeah, what Phil was referring to when he was mentioning that number is the PCI assessment costs. And that's when your hack leaks, valuable information for individuals, whether it's credit card, social security, debit card. And there are actually state by state values associated with the cost of notifying people, doing ongoing credit monitoring. And so those tend to rack up, especially if you have a database full of information, and it doesn't even have to be active users. It could have been something you collected, several years ago. And so as this information is accumulated and these hackers get in, they can release it or they just use it to their advantage. Yeah,
and it's important to note too on credit cards. If you accept credit cards as a merchant, part of the contractual liability you accept is if you are the vector or the source of a hack, all the fraud that takes place on the cards that were disclosed, so all the spending sprees that the bad guys go, that all comes back on you through those PCI assessments. It gets very expensive. So, the Target breach cost Target about $150 million. About 30 to 40 of that was just in forensics, their systems, rebuilding, and all that. The rest of that was paying the banks, all the fraud that happened on those cards. Their settlement with Visa was somewhere in the neighborhood of $50 million. Their settlement with Discover was 30, and I think their settlement with Amex was like 12. It was really, really expensive.
And with our industry, it's very normal because we have that rapport with customers because we go into their homes. We're there in the middle of the night when they need us, is that they'll give us credit card information, just say, charge me when you get a delivery. They don't care about the price per gallon. They don't care. They just want to be heated. So we have this information.
No, credit card numbers written on a slip of paper are a huge no-no, and it still happens. And I understand when you're in different areas of the U.S., a lot of people still use paper checks. Paper checks are pretty dangerous too. They have people's account numbers written right on the bottom of them, along with the routing number. There's a lot of damage you can do with a paper check. So, yeah, businesses, whether they like to or not, if they accept money, they're accepting a certain amount of liability with doing that.
Now, speaking about employees, you said that you also offer training. How long is that training, and who should be attending those?
So we generally recommend all employees that have an email account attend a training. And for most businesses, that just is all employees now. And the training can be anywhere from, you can make it 30 minutes or 3 hours. It depends on what you do. Obviously, if you're in a banking or a financial setting, we're going to want that training to be a little more exhaustive. If you're in, the construction field or something like that, where there's not a ton of email traffic or something, maybe you make it an hour or something like that. But the different software that we make available provides a certificate when people have completed the training. Obviously, there's little modules within it. You answer 1 or 2 questions to pass through the modules, but really the training is designed to get you to identify when you've got a phony email on your hands.
Sounds like the normal training that we have between like DOT and Homeland Security, because we have bulk tanks and we have hazardous materials. So sounds like it's almost part of this natural fold of business, is that, you have your hazmat training, but then you also have your cybersecurity training. Mm-hmm. It seems like this is now one and the same.
Yeah, well, and it's funny. So my wife both teaches, and she's a PhD student at University of Maryland. She had to take a super long training, and she's in a very safe university environment when it comes to the cybersecurity. But everyone at that school, all 25,000 undergrads, had to take the training.
Perfect. Thank you so much for spending your Thursday afternoon with us. I do want you guys just to hold on for a little bit while we say goodbye to folks. So thank you so much for joining us. And if you have any information you would like there is a survey at the end, and we'll be able to connect you with the guys who know it the best.